In 2009, Malaysia launched 1MDB with an ambitious public story, a state-owned investment vehicle that could attract global partners, accelerate development, and help the country move up the value chain. The narrative sounded familiar to many nations. Use a national fund to unlock large projects, bring in expertise, and generate long-term returns. The fund's creation sat close to the center of government decision-making because it was tied to national strategy, major financing decisions, and headline infrastructure plans. But large national funds succeed only when governance is stronger than ambition. That means clear oversight, separation of powers, independent boards with real authority, transparent reporting, and strict control over who can approve major transactions. In the early years of 1MDB, warning signs began to appear, not as loud alarms, but as subtle design choices that, over time, made the structure easier to bend. When a fund is allowed to operate with limited daylight, it can become dependent on a small circle of decision-makers and advisors, and that dependence can quietly replace institutional discipline. A key educational lesson in the 1MDB story is that the risk is rarely a single dramatic moment. Instead, it often begins as a series of reasonable exceptions, unusually fast approvals, complex deal structures that few people fully understand, and an increasing comfort with confidentiality. In well-run systems, confidentiality protects negotiations. In weak systems, it can become a shield that blocks accountability. When you combine that with the pressure to deliver big, visible outcomes, new projects, big partnerships, impressive numbers, internal skepticism can be treated as an obstacle rather than a safeguard. As 1MDB grew, it relied heavily on large-scale financing. Big financing is not automatically suspicious. It can be normal for national projects. The real question is whether each layer of complexity has a clear public purpose, and whether the checks and balances are strong enough to ensure that purpose is honored. When layers multiply, subsidiaries, special vehicles, unusual payment routes, transparency becomes harder for outsiders, and sometimes even insiders. That is when governance must tighten, not loosen. The 1MDB case later became widely described as a global financial scandal, not because national funds are inherently problematic, but because it demonstrated what can happen when a national vehicle is allowed to accumulate debt, complexity, and discretion faster than it accumulates credible oversight. Over time, international investigations would allege that billions were misappropriated, and multiple jurisdictions began probing the money flows, intermediaries, and institutions connected to the fund. For viewers trying to understand the early stage lesson, think of 1MDB as a case where the public promise was huge, but the control system, the boring rules, the independent gatekeepers, the routine transparency was not built to withstand the same scale of power and funding. And when the control system cannot match the ambition, the fund becomes vulnerable to being used for objectives that do not align with the public interest. By the time questions started growing louder, the stakes were already high. Reputations, political stability, public trust, and national finances. That is why this story is best understood not as a single bad deal, but as a gradual transformation where a fund designed to serve the public could be alleged to have been redirected to serve a network of private benefits. As 1MDB expanded, the story moved from domestic development to a web of international financial relationships. In large global finance, money often travels through intermediaries, banks, law firms, auditors, and corporate structures that exist for legitimate reasons. Yet the same tools can also create distance between the source of funds and the final beneficiary, making accountability harder unless controls are strict. One reason the 1MDB case became so instructional is that it shows how complexity can substitute for trust. When a transaction becomes too complicated to explain simply, people stop asking the most basic questions. What is the goal? Who benefits? What are the risks? Who signs off? If the answers require a specialized map and insider vocabulary, transparency is already losing. Later reporting and investigations described patterns that repeatedly appear in major financial wrongdoing cases. Large transfers linked to entities with limited operating history, rapid movement of funds across borders, and an ecosystem of supporting services that, whether through failure, negligence, or willful blindness, did not stop suspicious activity early enough. In 2025, liquidators filed a major claim in Singapore, alleging a bank failed to detect or respond properly to unusual transfers tied to 1MDB network, illustrating how the accountability story extends beyond any single country. It's important in an educational documentary to avoid turning this into a how-to. The key takeaway is not the mechanics, but the control failures. When oversight bodies lack independence, red flags can be minimized. When documentation is treated as a formality, approvals become rubber stamps. When reputational incentives reward deal completion more than risk management, gatekeepers become quiet. When accountability is fragmented across jurisdictions, each participant may assume someone else is responsible. Over time, international authorities allege that huge sums were misappropriated from 1MDB, an amount often cited as at least US $4.5 billion in public reporting linked to U.S. investigatory findings, with far-reaching consequences for enforcement and asset recovery efforts. A second educational lesson: the world's financial system is interconnected, but responsibility is often decentralized. That means a single weak link can enable a chain. In later years, Malaysia pursued or settled claims involving multiple institutions in connection with 1MDB-related matters, reflecting the idea that large-scale financial wrongdoing is rarely solo. At the same time, the story is also about how difficult it is to unwind complexity once it is built. Investigators must trace transactions across borders, navigate legal protections, and coordinate with many regulators. This is why recovery can take years, sometimes decades, and why prevention is always cheaper than repair. By the middle stages of the 1MDB saga, the public conversation had shifted. It was no longer about whether the fund could deliver development. It was about whether the fund had been used in ways that violated public trust, and whether the systems designed to protect public money had been bypassed or broken. One of the most striking aspects of 1MDB is how it became a multi-jurisdiction case study. Once money flows cross borders, investigations often multiply because different countries have different obligations: anti-money laundering enforcement, banking supervision, corporate governance rules, and asset forfeiture frameworks. In a globalized financial world, wrongdoing in one place can trigger legal consequences in many others. Public reporting shows how Malaysia's recovery campaign included cooperation with foreign authorities and actions connected to international institutions. For example, a major settlement involving a global bank's role in 1MDB-related bond deals became a continuing subject of scrutiny, with later reporting in 2025 highlighting disputes about how much had truly been recovered and how agreements were structured. An educational point matters here. Investigations are not only about punishing individuals, they are about validating facts, building a coherent timeline, and restoring trust in institutions. That requires evidence, not emotion. Courts and regulators typically look for patterns: who had authority, who benefited, what controls were bypassed, and how decisions were documented. As these probes progressed, a key figure often mentioned in connection with the broader allegations was Malaysian financier Low Take Joe, commonly known as Joe Low, who has remained a fugitive in much public reporting. In 2025, additional reporting and commentary continued to focus on claims about his whereabouts and the challenges of bringing him into a courtroom, while also noting that international notices had been issued years earlier. This highlights a third lesson. In international cases, justice and resolution move at different speeds. A court verdict in one country might be fast, Locating a fugitive or recovering assets in another country can be slow. The public can feel that nothing is happening, even when legal teams are working through complex procedures, identifying beneficial ownership, obtaining court orders, negotiating settlements, and verifying that recovered value truly returns to the public. Malaysia's public statements in 2025 emphasized how much had been recovered and placed into an official recovery account, an attempt to quantify progress and demonstrate results. The Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission reported total recovered assets linked to 1MDB reaching 29,752,034,475.13 as of March 17, 2025, described as a significant portion of the estimated recoverable amount. For viewers, numbers like this matter because they translate abstract wrongdoing into measurable outcomes. How much value can be returned, how long it takes, and what the state must do to pursue recovery. But numbers also raise questions. Recovered value is not the same as repaired trust. A country can recover money and still struggle to rebuild confidence in governance. The 1MDB investigations also showed how reputational damage spreads. Once a scandal reaches global scale, it affects perceptions of regulators, banks, auditors, and even the country's investment environment. This is why beyond courtroom outcomes, reforms become essential. Stronger compliance expectations, tighter oversight of public funds, and clearer accountability for decision makers. Over time, the 1MDB story moved into a long phase of courtroom proceedings, appeals, and public debate. This phase is crucial in a documentary because it tests a society's commitment to due process. Accusations must be proven, defendants have rights, judgments must be grounded in evidence. In late 2025, the legal chapter reached a major milestone. Reuters and other outlets reported that on December 26, 2025, a Malaysian court sentenced former Prime Minister Najib Razak to an additional 15 years in prison after convictions connected to the 1MDB case, including abuse of power and money laundering charges related to receiving billions of ringgit from the fund. What makes this moment educational is not the headline, but what it represents. A system confronting allegations involving a former national leader. That is never simple. Legal proceedings at this level occur under intense public attention and political pressure, yet the legitimacy of the outcome depends on process, evidence, cross-examination, judicial reasoning, and appellate review. Reuters reported further details, including the scale of financial penalties ordered by the court and asset recovery components tied to the judgment. And reporting from late December 2025 also noted Najib's decision to appeal, underscoring the continued legal pathway. From a governance lens, this chapter teaches power concentration increases vulnerability. When key decisions sit too close to a small circle, institutional friction disappears and risk multiplies. Political influence complicates reform. Even after elections change governments, networks and loyalties can remain. Accountability requires endurance. Complex cases take years, and institutions must remain steady long after the headlines fade. Another related courtroom narrative in late 2025 concerned requests about how sentences should be served. Reporting described judicial decisions rejecting a request for a different custody arrangement, illustrating how legal arguments can extend beyond guilt or innocence into constitutional and procedural questions. For an audience, the most important non-sensational insight is this: large public scandals often become a mirror. They reflect whether institutions can hold steady under stress, whether courts can operate independently, whether enforcement agencies can pursue evidence across borders, and whether recovered value truly returns to the public rather than disappearing into new forms of opacity. A scandal of this scale creates a second crisis after the first, the recovery crisis. Once money is alleged to have been misappropriated and moved through many channels, the state must choose between long litigation and negotiated settlements, or, more often, a mix of both. In 2025, Malaysia's recovery updates became more concrete. The Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission reported in March 2025 that recovered assets linked to 1MDB reached $29.752 billion, a figure repeated in Malaysian press coverage and official statements. This number matters not only because it is large, but because it reflects a structured effort to return value into a designated recovery account, aiming to show traceability rather than vague claims of success. Beyond asset recovery, there were continuing legal actions involving financial institutions. In mid-2025, Reuters reported that liquidators filed proceedings in Singapore seeking billions of dollars in relation to alleged compliance failures tied to suspicious transfers. This illustrates a reality viewers should understand. Recovery is not just about one mastermind, it's also about whether institutions that processed transactions should have acted differently. In another major development, the Financial Times reported that J.P. Morgan agreed to pay US dollars 330 million to Malaysia to settle 1MDB related claims, with the payment directed to Malaysia's Recovery Trust account and without admission of liability, as reported. Settlements like this are often controversial in the public imagination. Some people want full trials, others want faster recovery. The pragmatic truth is that governments often pursue both: litigate when necessary, settle when it returns value sooner and with less uncertainty. Meanwhile, reporting in 2025 continued to examine the earlier settlement involving Goldman Sachs and Malaysia, including ongoing discussion of what was recovered and the political sensitivity of how such agreements are evaluated. The educational lesson here is that recovery is a form of public administration, not just legal drama. It requires forensic accounting teams who can reconstruct years of records, international cooperation to freeze and return assets, careful governance so recovered value is transparently managed, public communication that is accurate, cautious, and evidence-based. Recovery also has a moral dimension. When public money is misdirected, the loss is not only financial, it is opportunity. Projects delayed, trust reduced, and political cynicism increased. Recovery campaigns can restore some value, but they cannot fully refund lost confidence. That is why recovery must be paired with reform, better transparency rules, stronger enforcement, and clearer lines of accountability for public funds. The 1MDB story is not only a Malaysian story. It has become a global case study in how modern financial systems, weak oversight, and concentrated authority can combine into a long-running public crisis. And it offers lessons for any country that runs national funds, state enterprises, or large public investment programs. First, governance must be engineered, not assumed. A national fund cannot rely on the integrity of a few people. It must rely on systems, independent boards, transparent procurement, external audits with real access, and regulators who can challenge powerful actors. When people say, "This would never happen here," they often mean, "We trust our leaders." The real question is, do we trust our controls? Second, the international system is only as strong as its gatekeepers. The 1MDB saga touched many institutions and jurisdictions. The fact that legal actions and settlements continued through 2025 shows how long it takes to process accountability once funds have traveled widely. This is why compliance culture matters, not just rules, but incentives and courage, the willingness to slow down a deal, ask for clarity, and refuse business when the answers are not good enough. Third, recovery is measurable, but trust is not. Malaysia's official recovery figures, tens of billions of ringgit, demonstrate significant progress, yet they also remind audiences that the recovery chapter is itself a governance project requiring transparency and careful stewardship. Fourth, the rule of law is a long road. Court outcomes reported in late 2025, including Najib Razak's additional sentence and ongoing appeals, show that accountability can advance even years after the earliest allegations. But rule of law strength is not measured by speed, it is measured by fairness, evidence, and institutional consistency. Finally, The deepest lesson is cultural. Public institutions need a habit of constructive skepticism. In healthy systems, asking questions is not disloyal, it is responsible. Documenting decisions is not bureaucracy, it is protection. Transparency is not a public relations burden, it is the foundation of legitimacy. If a national fund is meant to serve the public, it must be built so that even powerful individuals cannot easily override safeguards. The 1MDB case reminds viewers that integrity is not just a personal virtue, it is an institutional design choice. And that design, once strengthened, becomes the quiet force that protects public value long after headlines move on.